Okay, we're going to get started with this Brownfields public meeting about the Brownfields. I'm Michael Cuss. I'm the general manager at the Michigan City Sanitary District, the Michigan City Brownfield Coalition, and our 2018 EPA Brownfields Assessment Grant. That's what we're here to talk about today. This is our introductory public meeting that's set for today, May 22nd, 2019. The coalition members are the Michigan City Sanitary District, the City of Michigan City, and then the Michigan City Redevelopment Commission. Those are the members of the coalition. The agenda is going to be a welcome and introductions, what are brownfields, understanding of the grant process, site inventory and prioritization, Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental assessments, cleanup, planning and health monitoring, community outreach and public participation, communication, other funding sources, and then there'll be some time for open discussion if anybody has any questions or anything. I think I'll turn the rest of the presentation over to Len Hendricks. He's with Bruce BCA out of Indianapolis. He's our consultant that is working on this with the coalition, and he'll handle the rest of the presentation.
Thank you for having me. Just jump right into it since we've got quite a few slides and I don't want to take too much of your time and try to get through it all. So how did we get here? Meaning, how did this coalition come to being? The US EPA awarded Michigan City Sanitary District, the Brownfield Coalition, which, as Michael said, is the Sanitary District, the City of Michigan City, and the Redevelopment Commission, or MCBC as we've been calling it, an assessment grant in April of 2018. The application for that started probably back in November of 2017. It takes a while for them to kind of sort through that stuff. After the award, the city and EPA completed a bunch of paperwork, resulting in a work plan and a cooperative agreement by September of 2018. They put out an RFQ requesting qualified environmental engineering or consulting firms in August, and then they selected BCA as their qualified consultant to assist them with the implementation of the grant. And again, that was in September. This is just a kind of a stock EPA slide that sort of shows the basics, the elements of brownfield revitalization, what the local stakeholders might be involved in, as well as what the EPA grants and tools might be involved with. So from the start, you would determine the reuse goals of the city or the entity that wants to try and do their redevelopment process, identify any brownfields that are in the communities, prioritize the brownfields, and we'll get into a little bit more about the inventory and that sort of thing in a minute. Conduct the environmental assessments. That's what my company is mostly involved with. We are also, as Michael was saying, BCA has been selected as environmental consultant. We are paired or partnered with a local company, EI, Environmental Investigations, I think is their name. Incorporated, excuse me. I always get that wrong. And they're handling certain portions of the actual assessment process with us. You conduct environmental assessments, then you try to leverage funding resources, and that would be anything above and beyond what the grant would cover, and then move on to cleanup and revitalization to return the properties to productive use. This is just more of the same. What is a brownfield? The very basic definition that EPA uses is the property, any property where the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse might be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. That includes hazardous substances and petroleum products. The key word there is potential, because a lot of times sites may not actually have contamination, or they may not have significant contamination, but redevelopers or purchasers, even the cities themselves, might be afraid of being involved with them because they fear that environmental stigma. Grant was for $600,000 to the coalition to address hazardous substances and petroleum. The grant periods are 3-year periods, so this one began this past October 1st and runs through the end of September in 2021. And it's to be used to stimulate brownfield redevelopment. The benefits of brownfield redevelopment are quite many. These are just some of the more basic and easy ones, create jobs, removal of blight, increase property values, reduction of contamination, that's more the environmental side of things, bring back affordable housing, increase the tax base. Another benefit is a lot of times in areas where people are looking to develop or redevelop, the infrastructure is already in place because there were a lot of times buildings or property there, so all the lights, the sewer and everything else is already in place. And a lot of times the redevelopment process results in more green space than was actually there in the first place. So even sites sometimes that you would think might be fairly significantly impacted, there are things you can do and ways to work things out with item in order to make them parks or trails, rails to trails. All these rails to trails you see these days have to go through quite a process in order to be approved like that because, you know, they were former rail corridors. Rail corridors had a lot of, and sometimes significant impacts from the mostly former coal ash and cinders and from the steam engines back in the day. And some additional benefits of brownfield redevelopment, that can actually clarify environmental conditions in an area. A lot of times through the assessment process, you don't know what's going on below the surface, and that these types of grants are very helpful to help kind of clarify that situation. Make property more marketable, eliminate stigma to the property, and big thing is that most lending institutions, banks, anybody that's going to provide a loan or something will require it. They require some form of due diligence, and by using a grant like this to take those steps, those first steps in the process of due diligence can be very beneficial. There are limitations to what an EPA grant like this can do. It is what they consider an assessment grant. It does not allow for cleanup. It is not they will not do remediation. They won't be hauling dirt away. They won't be cleaning up groundwater. But it does allow you to perform an inventory, which the city has had an inventory previously existing to this grant. We have taken that inventory and kind of expanded it a bit, as well as prioritized a lot of the sites according to what the city views as their redevelopment needs move forward. Phase 1 environmental assessments, which I don't know if all of you are familiar with phase 1s. Phase 1s are basically the environmental history of the site. We look at old documentation, any old reports, aerial photos, old sandboard fire insurance maps. We do a site visit and actually see what's actually there right now. Look at all the neighbors to see if there's something going on a neighbor's property that might be impacting the subject site. You combine all that into a very long document with a lot of database searches and things like that, and it renders an opinion on the property to say what is the potential for environmental either contamination or impact. Sometimes it's low and you can work around it. Sometimes you get done with the phase 1 and you say we're done. At that point in time, if there's no evidence that something is impacting the property, you can just say it's done at that point in time. Other times, though, you've got to move on to a phase 2 assessment. Phase 2 is the physical part of it. That's when you see the drill rigs out there drilling monitoring wells or temporary sampling points, doing soil sampling, doing air monitoring sometimes, waste sampling. Just depends on what the media is that might be that might require some sort of testing or plan or investigation. And from that, then you can hopefully render an opinion on whether the property actually is contaminated. And then you might have to do a follow-up phase 2 supplemental where you try to delineate what the situation is. So first you're trying to find the presence of it. Once you've found the presence of it, you're trying to now how extensive is it? How bad is it? You know, is it manageable? And the thing that I've kind of not really talked specifically about here is that a lot of developers or people that are interested in redeveloping property are often, they don't, you know, in order to buy the property, they've got to go through this due diligence process, and it can get kind of expensive, I guess, especially when you get into the phase 2 portion of it. Phase 2s can range from $15,000 to $40,000 in a single round, and that's just in the initial stage where you're trying to find out if contamination is there. So they often don't want to mess with that. These EPA grants, being able to provide that kind of at-risk upfront funding is critical. It really, really, really helps the process and gets developers kind of interested and kickstarted as showing more interest in a piece of property, even if the property has a kind of a colored history or whatever, where it doesn't want to. You don't have a lot of faith that there's not anything there. So cleanup planning, that's the only part of I would say cleanup that this grant would cover. It will allow you to make documentation and plans for how you might want to clean up the property. And this would include, you could do like soil management plans, because a lot of times when you have maybe minor soil contamination where you can't just take soil and bring it off site and give it away as fill material or something like that. Soil management plan would say, okay, if you're going to dig below 3 feet, there's soil down there has got some issues with it, it has to go off to a landfill. Or if it's really bad, it might have to go off as hazardous material. So,
does that include cost estimates?
You can, yes, it would. Yeah, that, in fact, that's important. I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times assigning a number to a problem is all that is really needed. Because if you're looking at a site that has a value of, say, $3 million, and you come up with, it's only going to be about $150,000 to take the soil away, and that's, the developer's going to look at that as I'm just going to factor that into the cost of redeveloping the site, and they're not scared away by that. But if it's unknown, and there's potential that it could be $3 million to clean up the site, and when you get into chlorinated solvent plumes and things like that, that's real money at that point in time a lot of times. So yeah, that was good. I'm glad you brought that up, because assigning that dollar value, or at least a dollar estimate or even a range, can be a huge factor towards keeping people interested in a property. As well, this event that we're having right here is a community engagement event. The grant will pay for the expenses of engaging the public as best you can. And there's lots of creative ways you can do it. We've done things like gone to festivals and set up a booth and pass out brochures and pamphlets and things like this, as well as a standard kind of public meeting like this. Anything that you can be creative with that to engage the public, because really the public kind of drives this whole process, in the long run. So keeping them engaged is always a great idea. The inventory process, again, this is working with the city, with the coalition, to figure out what sites throughout the city are they most interested in having redevelopment take place. And they want to focus on areas, obviously, where you get the biggest bang for the buck. So, or in some cases, it might be the places where you have the best chance of redevelopment. It might not be the most glamorous property, but it's you're going to get it done. Typically, it involves a windshield survey where you drive around and look for properties that might appear to be either underutilized or closed, or you wonder why is that manufacturing facility closed on a Tuesday, midday or whatever. Sometimes you don't get it right, but a lot of times you can pick out properties that have something going on, even a vacant lot, because you don't know what used to be there, and you don't know why people aren't redeveloping that lot. It could be that the owner is asking too much money for it, but sometimes it ends up being because there's used to be a gas station, or it used to be a dry cleaner, and nobody wants to touch it. So this requires input from the city officials. Again, properties appear to be vacant or unutilized, and that they have real or perceived environmental conditions. This is just kind of a general map of the Michigan City area. There's 17 sites right now on the priority list for the city. They're kind of scattered really quite a long ways around the city. And I think, what do we have right now? About 5 of them that are in the process of going through phase 1s, phase 2s at this point in time. Kind of in the beginning stages, but it's moving along. So, phase 1s, as I explained, are just the environmental history of the site. We look at the old Sanborn maps, we look at aerial photos, we get these environmental database reports. There's a variety of companies that provide them, and they dig back through all of the databases available through EPA, through Indiana Department of Environmental Management, as well as any other agencies out there that might file an environmental report or collect an environmental report. and put it into their database. So these companies, you'll get sometimes hundreds of hits where a site, if it's in a very congested area and a lot of industry has been there, you'll have hits from the properties all the way around. And it's done as a radius search. So whatever your site is, it's a quarter mile around for petroleum issues, and it's up to a mile away for things like the MPL and stuff like that. So it can involve quite a lot of facilities that you have to sort through and sift through and decide whether or not it's a risk for your site. It will also contain information about your subject site as well. So that's the beginning of the due diligence phase. And then phase 2's, I'm sure you've seen, drill rigs and things like that out and about. Soil, groundwater sampling, air sampling, any type of testing that we can do or come up with to help make sure that we have a pretty fair understanding of what's going on the site environmentally. And a lot of that's driven by what did we find in the phase 1, including what did we find on a neighbor's property. Because if we know the up gradient groundwater direction is a dry cleaner, we're going to be pretty concerned and pretty conservative on trying to determine if it's impacting our subject site. So even though you might not be responsible for it, it adds to a lot of difficulty and things like that if your property is being impacted from an off-site source. And there are still requirements that you have to do as a landowner to protect the occupants of your property. So people in the building, you don't want a chlorinated solvent plume under the building where vapors can be coming up into the building and affecting the health of the people that are in your building. So you have to do those sort of due care obligations to make sure that they're protected. Cleanup planning, again, soil management plans, basically site management plans where you're telling people, okay, we've got this area marked off over here on a map. If you ever go to dig in that area, you're going to have to talk to ITEM. Sometimes they require that they be informed. You may have to hire, it may be a requirement in there that you have an environmental professional on site when that soil is being excavated to make sure that soil is being put in the right places, because it may be the first 5 feet you can take and move wherever you want on the site. That next 5 feet might be the contaminated zone, and it will have to go off to a landfill. Community engagement, all of the public's input is needed and welcome. A lot of times the public can help add to the inventory if they know of properties in and around their neighborhoods, places where they've worked in the past, that kind of stuff that might be now vacant. And they also have a lot of input on what to do with the property. Oh, we'd like to see that be a park, or we'd like to see that be a new theater or something like that.
Gas station.
So, yeah, a new gas station. Well, at least a gas station that has some controls on it so that it's not doing bad things. So, and then as well as developer input and investment. A lot of times developers will come to these kind of meetings and they have suggestions, or they're just really interested in seeing where the city's kind of headed with their plans. Michael and I are the key contacts for the grant process. I'm the consultant project manager, and he is the grant administrator at this point. So, and you feel free to call me if you have questions or anything like that, or Michael, I assume. I know you're busy. Well, just a small talk on leverage funding. If there is cleanup needed, and that's always the big, the big fear, I guess, on a property is who's going to pay for it, because it can get quite expensive very quickly. Depending on the type of issues, if it's a minor soil issue, not a real big deal a lot of times, but if it gets into groundwater issues, as soon as groundwater is affected, the state considers the groundwater theirs, and as soon as groundwater is affected above any of the screening levels, then that's considered third-party damage, and that's letter that they issue is considered a lawsuit against the property owner, and they have to react to that. So it gets expensive pretty
So
fast.
when you do these assessments, if you find something, do you have to report it then?
We do if it is of an egregious nature. If it's you get a little bit of petroleum or something, a little bit of hits on your instrumentation, and then you send that soil in or the groundwater in, and then you get a little bit in it, but it's not above the screening levels. It's really just between you and the landowner at that point in time in the city. But if it's a high number that's over the what they call the spill reporting levels, that kind of thing, yeah, we're pretty much obligated to do that, because there may be people that are being harmed by it. So we report it to the spill hotline. It's not always the worst thing in the world to do it, because sometimes what it does, it gets things moving towards cleanup anyway that was probably going to have to occur at some point in time. I know a lot of landowners, when they hear about this process, they're like, no, I don't want to do that, because I don't want them to find anything on my property. But if they ever go to sell it, and they ever want to sell it and that person buying it wants to get a loan against the property, it's going to have to be done sometime, and you might as well take advantage of the free money to do it, because all that upfront money, we've spent $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 on a single site for the assessment portion of it, and that's because there's great value in knowing what's there for the next phase, which is the redevelopment phases. So it's trying to convince them that EPA is not using this as a tool to go after contamination as a landowner. They're not trying to use this as an enforcement tool. EPA, in fact, they get a copy of every report, as well as IDEM does, a copy of the report we do, and neither one of them are really using it as that sort of a tool. They're not looking at this as a way to kind of pry into the property that they've been licking their chops over for years. It's just a matter of keeping them in the loop for things. So, and I would say this, it does not happen very often. I've been doing these grants for 7 years now, and hundreds of sites, and just a handful of them have ever had to report to a spill line or whatever. And that's because we found either free product gasoline, or we found chlorinated solvents to a certain level that is in the groundwater it needs to be reported because it's moving off site. Once you have things going off site, somebody's going to find it someday, and they're going to come back after you anyway. So it's better to just kind of get it out of the way. So. Okay, so leverage funding. Who could provide the money? And that's a problem from every level, from the landowner level all the way up to the municipality, is coming up with money to address actual contamination or real issues if they become known. So there are in a lot of cases, and in particular here in Indiana, because the laws are quite favorable. General commercial liability insurance policies can be a funding source. If, in particular, you have to prove there's groundwater contamination for starters, but if that criteria is met and it's moving off, it doesn't even really need to be moving off the property. It just needs to be of a level that exceeds the screening level, and at that point in time, you would want to report it to IDEM, because that can then, if they have even an old policy. That demand letter from IDEM, usually the insurance companies will have to have the duty to defend against that policy. So it can bring money into the pot that was previously unavailable. And that's one that is, it can be very successful and provide a pretty substantial amount of money towards cleanup. Private investment, if a developer wants to put up funds for the redevelopment process, or the cleanup in order to facilitate the redevelopment process, that happens a lot of times. There are some EPA cleanup grants available, and for the right sites, that can be an alternative. There's also some state funding. There used to be a lot more state funding back in the day, but that has kind of tapered off over the years. I'm hopeful at some point in time that they will be maybe increasing some of the funding that they have available, but it just depends. These are just some of the things. I'm sure there's other potential funding sources out there. You just got to look for them. That's it. You guys have any specific questions that haven't been addressed at this point, or anything that I might need to cover that I haven't yet, or anything that I skipped by so fast because I was trying to read fast? I was told I had a half hour and I'm right there. So
well, we got what, $2.3 million from insurance?
Insurance money. Hold on.
Mm-hmm.
So what constitutes, okay, so you do the assessment, but what constitutes saying we've got to move to phase 2 if you haven't done any sampling of the property? Is it just previous records of
it's a lot of records.
What was there?
Yeah.
And
if you have a vacant field out in farm country, there's very low likelihood that you would have an issue. In a city, that same whatever size parcel is going to have a lot more potential sources that might have affected it. But doesn't mean it's contaminated. It just means you've got to sort through more material. And you'll look at the site, you might see staining on the ground, a big oily patch out back where something has been parked for a long time and dripping, you know, or you might see vegetation that's highly stressed. You might see a whole bunch of floor drains inside a manufacturing facility, and they've got drums of chlorinated solvents sitting all around it. You know, the odds are that's a possibility that would be enough to say, I feel that there's a significant chance that something may have happened there. So that would be, they call it recognized environmental conditions, or RECs.
Okay.
You would say that's a REC. So in your phase one, you'll see usually at the end, there's a bunch of filters going on through the whole thing. And when you get down to the end, it really boils down to what are the RECs. And they could be far-ranging. It could be that the next-door neighbor has something going on. It could be a plume that is a half-mile away, but it's up gradient and it's coming your direction. Or could be coming your direction. So you just put that all those factors in, and it is a bit of a decision process. Sometimes you're like, well, they're pretty close to the site, but they're kind of down gradient, and what's our groundwater flow direction? You look up all sorts of data to try and figure out, what the potential for groundwater coming from that site to your site. You look for violations. Have they been a generator of hazardous waste all these years and had numerous violations, which means their housekeeping is probably pretty poor. So you look at that kind of stuff. You look at what they handled. If all they ever handled was canola oil, you're not probably as concerned if they're an auto body shop and they were handling a lot of different paints and solvents and things like that. So the type of industry will drive your decisions. The type of neighbors stuff going on will drive your decisions. You look at the old Sanborns, and a lot of times those old Sanborns had really good information on them, because you'll realize that, this used to be a coal yard. And you think, well, coal's not that bad, but the constituents that are in coal, and in especially the combustion byproducts, the coal ash and cinders, are heavy metals and polyaromatic hydrocarbons like benzoate pyrene and all that stuff. Arsenic, lead, mercury, a lot of that can be high levels in the soil, and to the extent that it can even get into the groundwater sometimes. So it's just a filter. You start at the beginning with kind of a clean page, and you look for all the data from the site walk, the review of site files. We look up items, virtual file cabinet they call it, which has reports sometimes, and if you suspect there's something you need a little more information about, you can look and see if they've ever had enforcement actions against them, or the subject site. Maybe they've had enforcement actions for all kinds of sloppy handling and things like that, and that's where that would raise a red flag. So kind of sort through it like that. And then you tailor your phase two to that. You say, well, we're really concerned about the property to the north, so you'll put your boring plan in place to accommodate for that, so or account for that, so that you make sure that you're picking up anything that might be coming from the north. You don't ignore everything else. You still might put a boring, here or there around the site, but you're trying to find the worst case that first go round. You want to find what is the worst on the site right now, and then once you get that, then you say, okay, where is it? Now I have to find out where is it on my site. Sometimes it's all over. You can't do anything about it. It's just the way it is. So
at phase one, you certify it and say there's nothing wrong here, and you don't have to worry.
Yep.
And then
that's the business of the environmental professional.
Right, and then that report sticks with the property.
Correct.
And then when the bank wants to lend, they can take that and say,
correct.
Okay.
There are the limitations on a phase one assessment is some of the information in the phase one has a 180-day shelf life. So if you were preparing for a transaction and you knew that it was about to take place, you would want to do your phase one as close to the closing date as possible, and then so that it overlaps there, so that you actually have a valid phase one at that point in time. So sometimes, like in this process here, when you're kind of just, if a property doesn't have a pending sale, you'll do a phase one, because it gives you the starting point and gives you the background. And that phase one is still useful, no matter if it's a couple years out of date or whatever. It's useful as a starting point, because you can still use the RECs for, in a lot of cases, to help you design a phase two or get started. And then you would do your next phase one right before the transaction. That way you're still within that 180-day range. And a lot of times you try to get with a valid and current phase one, and if you've done your phase two work and have things kind of completely outlined and known and delineated on the site, then you might be able to apply for, if you have to do some cleanup, you might then be able to apply for what's called a site status letter from IDEM, which says, okay, you had issues, you did your phase one, you did your due diligence in the phase two, You found it, you had some problems, you did your cleanup, and now we're telling you that there's not gonna be any follow-up work from IDEM. We're not gonna go after you. Sort of, it's not the exact same thing as a no further action letter, but it's very similar to that. And that can then be used in the transaction to help for lenders. A lot of times they're like, okay, now I'm cool for lending money against this site because IDEM's not gonna come after us.
What if I own a house and I just don't want this information known, and I never plan to sell it? I die and I give it to my children. That isn't a sale, is it?
Not really, no. And there's so many, and even between non-family members, that happens all the time. Land contracts, where somebody, we have a gas station site in Plymouth where the guy is buying it on a land contract, and they had an EPA grant, and he decided he wanted to participate in it, and we found contamination on the site. We had like 4 feet of gasoline on the groundwater on the site. It's a very tiny little site, but it's really weird. It's all contained on the site. It doesn't go off site. It's like a bathtub almost, the way the site's built. Anyway, he basically said, if I have to spend a dime, I'm walking. I'll turn it back over to the owners, because I don't have title to the place yet. But he really wanted the place because he'd already done a lot of reconstruction and redevelopment on the site. And we were able to use a 3-tiered funding approach for that site. The city agreed to fund two rounds of environmental investigation, which was enough. There's a program in Indiana called the ELF program, the Excess Liability Trust Fund, which is for petroleum sites. They pay in, it's like an insurance policy. Any registered underground storage tanks in the state are supposed to be registered through the state, and they pay a tank fee every year. And they fill out their form every year that says, I've got X number of tanks, they're this size, this is what I have in them, and all that. They pay their fees, and by having those fees, if their tanks ever leak, they can get money from ELF to help pay for some assessment, but mostly it's for cleanup. So it can actually be a very beneficial thing as long as they keep their payments up, like any insurance policy. And it's not that expensive. It's like $100 or something, or $190 or whatever per tank. So it's not that bad. In this guy's case, there's a $35,000 deductible for the ELF fund if you get coverage. So we determined that he had 100% coverage through ELF because the tanks that were on that gas station site they'd been pulled out of the ground back in like '89, but the previous owners had paid the tank fees, so it was covered. But to get paid, he didn't want to pay that $35,000, so the grant administrator said, well, we want to be able to redevelop this site, or want him to be able to continue redeveloping it. So they funded 2 rounds of phase 1 or phase 2 work there, which ended up being about $60,000, which was, when they take the percentages out for what they cover for ELF, was about the right amount to pay off the deductible. And we got approval from the ELF program to say, yeah, we'll count that towards your deductible as money going out. And we got private funding from insurance, his liability insurance. He, through about 4 or 5 years now of work on the site, he has not paid a dime out of pocket, and about $300,000 worth of work has been done already. So to try and not clean, the next phase will be actually removing. There's 1 tank left in the ground that nobody knew about, and that's probably the one that was causing all the petroleum on the surface, or on the groundwater surface. And that is scheduled to come out this year sometime. So, and then he'll have basically a clean bill of slate for his.
Well, apparently the city really wanted that developed.
They do, yeah. It's on a main corridor, and they just, you get almost every corner of every city at some point in time is at a gas station.
Oh yeah.
They just try to kind of keep
So, Glenn, I think I'd take a little time to go over some of the sites, okay?
That's fine. That's great.
Yeah, so, Mike, on those sites, can you tell us how they were decided?
Maybe. What we did was the coalition members worked together, and basically the planning department and the economic development departments took the lead on that, identifying different brownfield sites throughout the city, okay? And they put together a list of sites, and the mayor looked at it, and mayor approved these sites. That's how we came up with this. We were trying to get it down to 10 sites, so we'd have a priority list of 10, and then whatever we had after that. But it worked out that we just came up with 17 sites, and we just went ahead with all 17 sites. The other thing I wanted to add is that this was the largest EPA Brownfields grant in the state of Indiana in 2018. No other city in the state got any more money than Michigan City. And you know, it's a real credit again to Mayor Muir and what he does for the city and brings this money into the city to help do this kind of stuff, to help development, and just a real testament. When you're getting the largest grant in the state of Indiana, that really shows the leadership that he brings, that Mayor Muir brings to this city. These are the 17 sites. They are, the first site is a Pioneer Pier, and they have signed off on all the access agreements. Basically, I drafted a letter. This was a lot of work. We drafted a letter that talked about the program. We sent that out to every one of these owners, and then there's 17 sites. I ended up sending out 50 letters because there's a bunch of different properties, and I had a whole bunch of different addresses, which I didn't know which was correct or not, and sent out 50 letters, and then I started calling people after I sent the letters out. Done a lot of work. So far, Pioneer Pier has agreed to participate in the program. This one here is called ITW Redhead, which is right over here at Liberty Trail and 12. The gentleman told me that he's interested in participating, except that he's selling the property, and if he sells the property and he's got a closing date of like June 5th or somewhere in there, he's hoping, and then you know he doesn't own it anymore, so he said contact the new owner. So then the next one is a Pullman Barker property. All the property owners there have agreed to participate. Let me see if I can get this to move up. The station block property, there's 2 station blocks. This is just a regular station block. I guess we have station block and station block west. So I don't know if this is station block east or
that's
just
station block east there.
And there are 7 different property owners there, and 2 of the 7 have already agreed to participate, waiting on some information from the other 5. The Dwyer Instruments, there's 2 property owners there, and we've got 1 out of the 2 that have agreed. Actually, the second one has agreed to participate, but I just haven't got the signed access agreement from that person yet. The Federal Mogul site was not eligible for this program. You know, we identified it because of what, some enforcement action or something, if I remember correctly.
It's involved in some form of an agreed order right now through the federal government. So that's the thing on one of the, and if I could just go for a second here about eligibility. All sites that you might be considering for using EPA grant funds have to kind of be vetted through an eligibility process. And there's 2 kinds. You can go ask for eligibility for hazardous substances, or you can ask for eligibility for petroleum. And EPA is the one that determines eligibility for hazardous substances, but IDEM administers the eligibility of the petroleum sites. So you turn in what's called an eligibility determination request. It's a lot of basic information of what you know about the site up front, and sometimes it's not much. Sometimes you really don't, there's just not a lot of available details out there until you do the phase 1. So you kind of have to speculate a little bit. Well, it's next to the railroad tracks, so maybe they had a siding there or something on it. It's on a street corner, and there's gas stations on every other corner. It's possible it had a gas station, or you're using, well, there are 3 gas stations all around it, so maybe there's impact from the neighbors. So anyway, the idea is you're trying to build a case for why the EPA should say, yeah, that site's eligible. One of the things as the main criteria is that the entity that has the grant, so in this case the coalition, can't have ever contributed to contamination at the site. The city can own the site, or they don't have to own the site. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, but you can't say take an old landfill that the city used to actually put their debris or junk into. You can't use that the grant funds to try and assess that, as well as it's just the city entity or the coalition. If it's a petroleum site, IDEM does it a little bit differently. They actually say that the current owner and the immediate past owner can't have ever dispensed or used petroleum products on the site, because they don't want somebody just going and having made a mess out of the site and now having the EPA fund their assessment of that site. So that one gets a little bit trickier. It's a lot harder to get petroleum eligibility because of that rule, because so many times the property's been in the same hands for a long time, and if they used to run a gas station on the site, or if they ran an auto service station, their service center, it makes it hard. So we fight that battle all the time. So.
And Trainer Glass was our Site 10, and the owners there have all agreed to participate. Marquette Mall is an interesting one. I've got actually 3 out of the 4 owners, and the 4th owner is the Sears, owns the, I guess they own the Sears that used to be at Marquette Mall, was not part of Marquette Mall, it was its own, they own the property, just Sears does. So, you know, we talk a lot at this meeting about how the help that this man gives us all the time, our attorney, and I'll tell you what, you call these other attorneys, you get no response a lot of times. I've called this attorney from up there at Sears, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 times emailed. Hopefully, maybe they'll respond. Chair Factory haven't gotten anywhere there. Ameriplex, 2 out of the 5 have said they wanted to participate. And then I think there's, a few more here. The Tallis Decker site, they're all in. And the Station Block West, I actually have 6 now. This is a little outdated. Well, the man said he was going to sign it. He hasn't sent it to me yet. So we have 6 out of the 7 there have agreed. So those are your 17 sites, and that's where we stand right now on each one of these issues.
So can you get grant money if you don't have their approval or access? You know, can you do a phase 1?
It helps to have. Oh, you mean?
You know, you could do phase 1 and not move on to the phase 2 because you don't have access.
It's pretty hard because you're supposed to perform a site inspection. If you can't get on the site to do that, then it really
for phase 1 you need.
Yeah, for that, and for phase 2, obviously you can't go drill a hole. Right. Somebody's paving up without.
That's actually a question that I get a lot is, well, why do you need me to sign this just to do the phase 1? And I said, well, we probably don't really need you to sign it to do the phase 1, but if we end up having to go to the next level, you're going to need it. Right?
Phase 1, you actually do need to do a site inspection, all inside every building.
Oh, you still have to go on site and do a site inspection.
Site reconnaissance.
I see. Okay.
That is and that is one part of when I was talking about the phase 1 has a shelf life of that 180 days. It's things like your interviews. So you're interviewing site owners, site managers, city officials, health departments, things like that. Those have a limited amount of time, 180 days. The site inspection has a limited shelf life, as well as your database searches. Those have a limited time. There are certain aspects like aerial photos, topographic maps, sandborne maps, things like that. Those aren't going to change. Those are all in stone already. So those are. You could, I guess, when you go to do a phase 1 update, you can do a lesser effort, I guess, because you're only updating the things that you have to. You take the existing report and you update those things that have a shelf life, and so a lot of times it costs less, I guess, if you're looking at it from a dollar value on a phase 1.
And as a board members, the Seneca, we did that. We updated the Seneca, as you remember. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there's no other questions then. I think that. Do you have any other questions? Anyone?
Yeah.
Sir, do you have any?
You can always contact me, by email or whatever if you have questions in the future.
And we plan on having a booth at the Conference on the Environment and probably some of these same slides, and we're working on some posters and stuff right now and some updates of where we stand on that, so some more public outreach at the Conference on the Environment. So, okay, folks, thank you for allowing us to have this public meeting, and hopefully you learned something.
And if you see something